7th of October, when a new world has opened up for us, and most of it doesn't look very pleasant. We take this opportunity to express our solidarity with all the Palestinians, and in particular the people of Gaza, but now also the people of Lebanon and the people of the West Bank. And we did not say much about what is happening, what we are seeing, because it's evident for everybody. But I think what we could point to is the deteriorating level of morality in the world, and in the Arab world in particular. I think what is most painful is that in the Arab world, the regimes, and even we know that the people have all the sympathy for the Palestinians, but the expression of solidarity has been really very weak for no reasons we know and reasons we probably have to think about. So, but I have to say that we haven't planned this event deliberately to be on the 7th of October. This is just a coincidence. John's schedule was only available this week, and we chose this day because also it was the most convenient day of the week. But it is an opportunity, nevertheless, to mention this. It's my pleasure to introduce today Professor John Keane, Professor of Politics at Sydney University, and a very old friend. I think we probably met first in April 1997, when we had a brief meeting, and then I was, after that, invited as a visiting researcher, I think, or fellow at the Center for the Study of Democracy. It's an interesting place founded by John Keane in 1989. And as he was telling me this morning, he only got £200 from the dean at that time to found this interesting center. And next November, it's going to celebrate its 35th year. And me and John, I think, hopefully will be there because it is a celebration of John. It became one of the most interesting establishments in academia in Westminster, in London, and also I think internationally. And in this instance, I want to tell a short story about as soon as I joined CSD, I was given an office in Wells Street, which at that time was a peripheral area of the university. It's not far, they're not far from the University of Westminster is in the heart of London in Regent Street, very short distance from Oxford Street. So it's very central, and this office was about a block away or 2 blocks away. And of course, due to my charisma, later the whole institute came there. But the story about to tell is that I was given the office, a computer, and an email. And I was, of course, pleased. But nobody knew about that email. However, 4 hours later, I got an email from a certain Charles Kurzman, a very famous person who wrote about Islamic liberalism, asking me for help in another book he wants to write. Now, and up till today, I'm wondering how he has found about my email within 4 hours of me getting the email when I didn't inform anybody about it, even my family. I leave you to, to comment about that. But John he identifies mainly as Australian, although he has many other, I think, tangential identities. He was in Britain, he was in Canada, he has some Irish roots, but he identifies with Adelaide, which he defines as one of the first liberal colonies in the empire, where women has got the right to vote in the 19th century, and where the vote for universal vote for males has preceded that. It was also associated with important liberals like John Stuart Mill and others. So it was, in a sense, as somebody called, or as he himself, others defined it as a paradise of dissent in the empire. I think he probably has become infected with that malaise. John has done his PhD at the University of Toronto, and this was in part coincidental, because he was also offered a fellowship at, or he was offered a grant at Oxford University, but he wanted at that time to work with Isaiah Berlin. I don't know why, but he was told that it is not by Isaiah Berlin himself, that he would not essentially get Isaiah as his supervisor, because the system was that you apply and then there is a queue or whatever. Of course, in Toronto, he worked with C.B. Macpherson, a very interesting theoretician and of the left side of the spectrum of politics. Of course, he's very famous. Everybody knows him. To work with him would be a great privilege. After that, when he moved to Europe, he was very influential and important in the work of dissident intellectuals in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, where he used to secretly move there and meet with dissidents, with hiding usually papers in different places. And he, I think there, he got the idea of focusing on civil society. I think he was one of the most influential people in reviving the concept of civil society, which he at that time was a little bit, has gone into oblivion, or at least neglect. He did write quite a few books about that, and he became one of the best known, I think, for that, before he became well known for democracy and his writing on democracy. I think I now introduce Professor John Keane, to deliver the opening inaugural lecture of this year. Please join me.
No, it's not. Yes, it is. Shukran jazilan, Professor El Effendi. Ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum, marhaban, masa el khair. I am very delighted and honored to be here. I thank you with many thanks. I'm especially honored to present the inaugural lecture for 2024-2025. Staff and students, ladies and gentlemen, today marks the first anniversary of the outbreak of a terrible war with potentially catastrophic consequences for your country, the region, and the wider world. So it will come as no news to you when I say that we're living in an age of multiplying wars, or that millions of people at various points on our planet are gripped by feelings that the world is sliding into confusion, lawlessness, and violent disorder, and that if current trends continue, a mega war is coming and that things are going to end badly. I think their gloom and caution are understandable. Think of the symptoms. Global military spending has been rising for nearly a decade. Last year, it increased by nearly 7% in real terms. An American president, lost in a mental fog, we could say, approves the bombing of Yemen and the largest US naval battle since World War II, the occupation of eastern Syria, combat operations in Iraq, all without the approval of Congress, then asserts, and I'm quoting, that the United States is not at war anywhere in the world. A president who urges an Israeli ceasefire while feeding its war machine with weapons that make peace impossible, and simultaneously, on another front, finances an unwinnable war against Russia, authorizes long-range weapons for use against people inside its territory, and refuses to agree to the negotiations that would halt the senseless killing and environmental destruction. Meanwhile, fears are growing that global warming will trigger the mass homelessness of people, as is already happening in Sudan, where a deadly uncivil war backed by outside forces has uprooted the lives of at least 11 million people and plunged half the population into hunger. And of course, symptomatic are the planned genocides in Gaza and the West Bank, in Syria, in Myanmar, where, following the 2021 coup d'etat, a nasty military government, in open defiance of the ICJ, terrorizes some 600,000 mostly Muslim Rohingya peoples in a hellscape of shelling and sexual violence, torture, and other forms of brutality. It's in this context that I think there is the revival of some old proverbs. We hear more about war through media, for instance. War is, so to say, the rhetoric of our times. It's said, things are said, such as there's a time for peace and a time for war. We hear that truth is war's first casualty. We hear that sovereignty must be defended. We hear that war is capitalism with the gloves off. We hear that it's easier to begin a war than to bring it to an end. And we hear, often quoted George Orwell's remark, that the quickest way of ending a war is to lose it. It is in this context, I think, of the normalization of war and growing anxieties about a future mega-war that these dicta, these often quoted dicta, are having the effect of normalizing war, as if war is somehow synonymous with the human condition. Mr. Occupy Mars, I would call him, the world's richest man, Elon Musk, said very recently, and I'm quoting, "All creatures fight. Animals in the jungle every single day, every minute, are constantly trying to kill each other. We humans are not unusual in that respect." What I want to say in this lecture, in the opening thought, is that this kind of normalization of war involves the removal of history. It's as if history, time, goes missing in action. And that's very unfortunate because in matters of war, as I'm going to try to convince you in this inaugural lecture today, in matters of war, history is crucially important. Not only because war, as the anthropologist Margaret Mead pointed out many times, war is a human invention. There was not always times in the era of Homo sapiens, let's say, where war existed. War, as she pointed out, is an invention just like the cooking of raw food. History matters as well for another reason. We understand that the modes of war and the weapons of war change through time. And there's yet another reason, which is that history is important because it helps us appreciate the novelty, the strangeness, the fleetingness of the times in which we live. The rule, it's a very elementary one, is that when we're ignorant of the past, invariably we misunderstand the present. History really matters, as I'm going to try to show to you by proposing an unorthodox account of the feeling that's widespread that our world is spinning out of control and hurtling towards military disaster. Here is the unorthodox idea that I want to put to you and to make a case for its plausibility. In matters of war, I think we are living in a strange world unknown to our grandparents and great-grandparents, a world very different than that of the Cold War of the 20th century, or recent talk, for example, by Niall Ferguson, of a new Cold War II. We have entered, I want to say to you, the age of destructive meta-wars, and I'm going to try to define that phrase. It is a period in which wars rely upon digital communications technologies. Not only are the structures of armies being transformed, but the weapons of warfare, Hellfire precision-guided missiles, for example, are part of this development of meta-wars. Meta-wars that I'm going to describe are also, paradoxically, wars that are represented through media by governments, by military PR propagandists, by breaking news journalists, and so on, in which war becomes gamified. War undergoes a beautification, I'm going to suggest, and that millions of people, my suggestion is, are lullabied into a nonchalance about these wars that seem to be emptied of blood and cruelty and genocidal destruction. What I want to say is that these are, in this era of meta-wars, public indifference towards war is flourishing. This may not be the case in your region, but I'm describing ideotypically Europe, North America, parts of Southeast Asia and elsewhere, where feelings of emotional disconnection, cold unconcern about these wars, of people who are preoccupied with cluttered lives, what we're witnessing is the birth of a kind of indifference towards war. I'm going to try to explain that. And finally, on a more hopeful note, I'm going to say that this era of meta-wars is an era in which a new kind of journalism has been born. I called it rebel journalism, in which there is an attempt to display, to reveal to publics the enormous cruelty of the wars that I'm describing as meta-wars. To step back just for a moment, what I want to suggest to you is that you cannot understand the wars of our era without understanding their entanglement with the unfinished digital communications revolution that is going on under our noses, so to say. I studied in Toronto, as Professor El Effendi has just mentioned, where Harold Innes, Marshall McLuhan, and other scholars taught us as students that media of communication are just not add-on features of any given society. Media should not be understood as timeless, neutral channels that convey so-called information. in a way, the Toronto School outdid Marx. For the Toronto School, in the period when I was there, wanted to say that Marx was not correct in saying that at the base of every society are forces and relations of production and the dynamics therein. Much deeper, so to say, is the way that modes of communication are at the foundation of every given society, and such that, according to the Toronto School, these modes of communication structure our bodily senses. They structure our sense of mobility, of space-time. They pre-structure patterns of cognition, mental horizons, and they even shape the conduct and interpretation of war. For example, and I will be very brief about this, if we think about the era of oral communication, the conduct of war and news of war were conveyed by word of mouth and messages carried by foot runners and donkeys and horses and camels. With the advent of literacy, armies and battlefronts and news from battlefronts was conveyed at very slow snail's pace via the printed word. And what is interesting is the way that all of the treatises we have in multiple languages about war, Sun Tzu in China, or let's say von Clausewitz's Vom Kriege in German. What's interesting is that these books were written after wars. And if you take the example of von Clausewitz, very famous text, this book, published in 1832 posthumously, was published in a period where, for example, the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, a major turning point in European history, was a battle news about which took 3 days to reach London over a distance of no more than a couple of hundred kilometers. It was typical of the era of the printed word. The Toronto School pointed out that the electrification of news of war was all important. The beginnings of mass broadcasting of war are actually traceable to the Russian-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. McLuhan, part of the Toronto School himself, was especially interested in television. According to McLuhan, the Second World War was a radio war, and the Vietnam War was the first television war, he famously wrote during the 1960s. This was the first time that journalists equipped with cameras would place cassettes on jet aircraft, and these jet aircraft would carry that footage across the Pacific, for example, to North American audiences, where next morning on breakfast television there would be pictures from Vietnam. I quote from a book of his in 1968. "We are now in the midst of our first television war," he wrote. "The television war has meant the end of the dichotomy between civilian and military. The public is now a participant in every phase of the war, and the main actions of the war are now being fought in the American home itself." He went on to say in other writings that one of the effects of the televisualization of war was that war, as it were, drew closer to the bodies of people, as if war resembled the smell of a cigarette, as McLuhan put it in very 1960s terms. What he wanted to say and invited us to remember is the key historical point. In matters of war, the reigning forces and relations of communication structure how war is prosecuted, how war is reported, why this or that war is deemed significant, and how it feels to victims and witnesses alike. What McLuhan did not live to see were remarkable things such as the live broadcasting of war. You may not know, but this first happened in the 1991 Gulf War coverage by CNN. And there were bizarre moments, for example, the American Operation Restore Hope in Mogadishu in Somalia, where journalists actually greeted American troops as they arrived on the beaches. This was something that McLuhan would have been very interested in, but he did not see. What McLuhan also did not see is the digitalization of communications and the way in which the shift to digital technologies would have a transformative effect on the modus operandi of armies and their weapons of war, and the way that the digitalization of communications would immerse audiences in a strange new world of integrated newspapers, radio and television, satellite, fiber optic, Wi-Fi linked world in which war is mediated by PCs and laptops and cameras and podcasts and audio books and chatbots and digital marketing, instant messaging, cloud storage, and audiovisual conferencing tools such as WebEx or Zoom or China's Tencent's VooV. Enter the world, 21st century world of meta wars. The dynamics I'm about to describe to you are meta, from the Greek meta, in the first sense that these are wars that are unlike any previous wars. I repeat the point that these are meta wars in the sense that they take us into a world that is after or beyond. This is one meaning of the word meta, a world that our ancestors would not easily have recognized. Of course, the technologies of war, ARPANET is the best known example, were born of military-industrial complex funding. The aim was to build hot potato communication links that would survive a nuclear war, for instance. This is a world, the age of meta-wars, in which military structures are transformed. The United States could not operate efficiently and effectively its command and management structures of its 800 military bases in over 75 countries without digital communications technologies. Nor could China's People's Liberation Army operate its Djibouti military base, or land a spacecraft on the far side of the moon, or operate its space station Tiangong, Heavenly Palace, without these technologies. And we see in this period of meta-wars the restructuring of armies such as the Ukraine army, which is now reduced to battalion size and much flatter and more networked. This is possible because of the harnessing of digital communication networks. This is also a period, as you know very well, in which the weapons of war become lethal digital tools. Think of AI machine learning systems like Israel's Hapsporah, the Gospel, Lavender, and Where's Daddy? They have been described as tools that produce mass assassination factories, where digital communications become the mode through which targets are selected and civilians are killed in very large numbers. This is an era, of course, in which killer drones dispatched from the armchairs of distant control rooms are part of this era of wars. This is an era in which bombs disguised as booby-trapped wireless communication tools are used. This is an era in which attack helicopters can liquidate targets 11 kilometers distant, where the pilots cannot see the people they are annihilating or the buildings they're destroying. And this is a period in which, for instance, the People's Liberation Army has stationed Wi-Fi operated robots on the border with the high altitude border with India. McLuhan spoke of the coming of war into our living rooms, as I've mentioned, but I don't think he could have foreseen another development that is unique to our age of meta-wars. I'm still speaking about the first sense of meta. That is a trend towards the use of digital technologies to kind of frame war through multimedia, 3D public gamification, I would say. War comes to have, in this sense, a second meaning of meta. War, it's as if we could say Mark Zuckerberg now designs war reportage. If you think about the way that you receive communications from battlefield zones, you will begin to see that digital communication structures are part of the public representation of wars, the mediation of wars. For instance, the US Marine Corps trains its troops using battlefield simulator programs. In the age of meta-wars, war reporting itself has gone digital. A large gaggle of skilled and seasoned journalists and public relations and marketing professionals function as the playwrights of war reporting. We could say that these dramaturgs of war speak meta-speak. I will give you an example. Colonel Natalia Humenyuk, spokeswoman for Operational Command South in the Ukraine, tells Ukraine television audiences things like, I'm quoting, "The counteroffensive in the south of Ukraine is moving forward. The Russian army is demoralized." Meanwhile, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov chips in, quote, "Our military does not hit social facilities and residential neighborhoods and does not hit civilians." There are familiar figures in this era of meta-wars. Biden's Karine Jean-Pierre and Jake Sullivan. The unfunny Melbourne-born Israeli public relations man, Mark Regev, who swears that as a democracy, Israel, and I'm quoting, is keeping civilian casualties to a bare minimum. He repeats that. This is part of the mediation of war in our times. And you may not know that a world's first and historical first has just happened in the Ukraine, where an AI-generated digital spokesperson now delivers mainstream media reports. Her name is Victoria Shi. She's a character modeled on a Donetsk-born singer and former contestant of the Bachelor reality show. She delivers messages about the progress of the war in Ukraine, and she boasts that she is fluent in 30 languages, that this is an example of cutting-edge wartime diplomacy, and she says, for fun, that she always looks good, I'm quoting, in the morning because she doesn't stay out late at night. This is a robot who is delivering reports from the war front, so to say. In this age of meta-wars, I want to say, mainstream media performances are laced with war room briefings by military commanders, accredited experts. There are lots of images of smoke-filled battlegrounds, of fighter jets overhead, of tanks and troops and wrecked buildings and burning fields and displaced civilians. We could say more than that, that to use the language of video games, multi-game player dynamics are becoming the norm. Soldiers using fake social media accounts, as you know well, upload images and clips of their strikes and maneuverings to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. Civilians are invited into the game rooms. The Russian government approves the use of popular video games such as Roblox and Minecraft, owned by Microsoft, in which Russian soldiers battle against Ukrainian Nazis and conquer Ukraine territory. Civilians join cyber armies to feed on-the-spot battlefield intelligence to their armed forces. There are vloggers, such as the Israeli TikTok influencer Rom Karmi at Barefoot, who provides running text and video commentaries. And of course, not to be forgotten are, to use the language of video games, lone shooter star performers. In a country in Central Eastern Europe, almost every day or evening, a president of a war-ravaged country who was previously, as you know, a comedian and a television actor, the star of a series called Servant of the People, delivers moral appeals for military help to domestic and global audiences. To home audiences, he says things like, as he did quite recently, and I'm quoting, "I thank each of our combat brigades, all the soldiers and commanders who are destroying the enemy with all their might, and in particular using our drone capabilities with precision." When he's abroad, he tells the Knesset that Russia is preparing the final solution for Ukraine. When he's in Ottawa, he speaks differently. When he's in New York, as he was recently, the president, Zelensky, rejects Chinese and Brazilian peace plans to end a 3-year war by denouncing their diplomats as apologists of colonialism. Notice, ladies and gentlemen, until this point of this lecture, there's been almost no mention of the blood and guts and mental and environmental sufferings produced by meta-wars. It's a weirdly puzzling feature that I'm going to describe. It's a weirdly puzzling feature of meta-wars. That is the way that the hellish brutality of battlefield violence is both neutralized and rendered aesthetically attractive to media audiences. My thought is that war becomes an elaborately staged tableau, a picturesque tableau designed to transfix audiences and to wall them off from war's horrors. It's as if war becomes bloodless. It undergoes a certain beautification, much more subtle and more insidious than, for example, Walter Benjamin, the great German critic in the 1920s, noticed about the advent of electronic broadcasting, where he spoke about the aestheticization of war. What we're witnessing is something much more advanced, much more insidious, and of much greater consequence. The public beautification of war, I'm speaking descriptively, if sarcastically, is among the oddest features of these meta-wars. These are meta-wars in the sense, the second sense, to which I've already alluded. Gamification. Yes, media reports are awash with dazzling images of drones in the sky and tanks advancing across fields, etc. Yes, there are press conferences, footage of diplomats sitting around flagged tables. And yes, there's a non-stop deployment of metonyms, keywords, cliched phrases, such as incursions, unconfirmed reports, footholds, confrontations, ground assaults, power targets. It's the Israeli term, by the way, for the total destruction of hospitals, high-rise residences, universities, mosques, and other civilian targets. Safe zones, ceasefire negotiations, civilians fleeing fighting, overcrowded shelters, tent camps, peace talks. But war is no longer death's feast. It's as if war is bloodless. My point here is that in both democracies and despotism, such as the Russian kind, governments do more than ensure that truth is the first casualty of war. Yes, they tell lies, they bullshit, they peddle calculated silence. There are no angels in metaverse wars, it's true. You cannot, for example, find in Ukraine the number of Ukraine soldiers daily who are killed or wounded in action. George Orwell, I think, was right to warn against war hawk politicians who twist syntax and words, and I'm quoting, spray forth the correct opinion as automatically as a machine gun spraying bullets. But I doubt whether George Orwell could have imagined how, in the multimedia age, the digital age of meta-wars, there's much more than government censorship. War is aestheticized. There's war on the language of war, new forms of meta-speak, I would say, in which we hear phrases such as surgical strikes and collateral damage and civilian casualties and safe zones and special operations. And it's true that military maneuvers come wrapped in multimedia publicity of all kinds, commanding officers who are trained in the arts of avoiding publicity and gruesome realities, for instance. The point of all of this is to turn war into a spectacle, into a kind of tactical shooting stage performance, a kind of Battlefield 1 type video war game created and directed by the governing authorities. At every point, at every moment, the goal is to disparage the adversary, peddle the conviction that this war is a just war, to say that things are going well, to publish instant denials, but to throw out the dead bodies when nobody is watching. News, bad news, is bathed in silence. This is not just a problem of governments and armies. It's interesting for me and part of this age of meta wars, that governments are joined hand in hand by for-profit corporations and taxpayer-funded media platforms such as the BBC or the CBC or Deutsche Welle. They also contribute to the framing of war as a bloodless video game. Let me give you some examples. The French media anthropologist Célia Chirol, the first person to study French coverage of the aftermath of October the 7th, has shown that during 1 week in mid-January 2024, the most watched 20 news programs on taxpayer-funded TNT devoted 29 seconds in 1 week, 29 seconds to Gaza and to the fate of Palestinians. Why do commercial and taxpayer-funded BBC-type media outlets, platforms, why do they report war in this bloodless way? There are several reasons, I believe. It is partly that they have a habit of bowing down and sucking up to governmental censors. It's partly that governments provide them with cheap and easy handouts, which serve as easily recycled raw material for their own copy. It's also that editors in these non-governmental media platforms fear government threats of harassment. For example, those moments when George W. Bush warned media critics of the Iraq invasion that they would be treated as the fellow travelers of terrorism if they reported the war in unorthodox ways. And that had consequences. One study, an important study of the first 40 hours of that invasion, showed on American television that there were no images of dead bodies. It was as if this was a war without any casualties. This is part of the beautification of war that I'm trying in rather a verbose way to describe. In Germany, something similar has happened. If you look at the media giant, it's the largest in Europe, Axel Springer, you will see that if you work for Axel Springer as a journalist or a media PR person, you sign an oath of loyalty to Israel. You are not allowed to raise questions about the current genocide. The same happens in CNN. In a memo which I've looked at entitled From Mark, the new CNN editor-in-chief, Mark Thompson, formerly of the BBC, told his journalists that they should remember that the key significance of October the 7th is that this was a Hamas attack and this was mass murder and kidnap of civilians, and that this is the headline story that CNN should bear in mind. And you will know as well, as part of this beautification of war in the non-governmental media sector, that giant media platforms, Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, engage in what is called shadow banning, the deletion of email accounts, the removal of content linked to government-sensitive keywords, the airbrushing of hashtags such as hashtag Free Palestine and hashtag I Stand with Palestine. The camouflaging of death by non-governmental media, I want to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, happens for other reasons. It's partly the withdrawal of foreign correspondents and the reliance upon fixers who are usually very closely allied with militaries on the ground. One gets a form of 21st century propaganda as a consequence. It's partly also that this beautification of war depends upon media celebrities. Remember the moment when Anderson Cooper was parachuted into Ukraine to add a human interest dimension to the coverage of war. This outsourcing of journalism is the key reason why the cross-checking of reports is very difficult, so that when, for example, journalists report statements issued by Myanmar's armed forces, the Tatmadaw, there's no cross-checking of this because those who are delivering these reports are themselves embedded in the forces that are fighting these wars. And there's another curse, I think, in the non-governmental sector of media, another curse that contributes to the beautification of war and its breaking news journalism. I could talk at some length about how breaking news journalism is in alliance, so to say, with this beautification of war. You know very well that breaking news journalism must hunt for clicks. Boredom is the enemy of breaking news journalists. Rob Weinberg, a Dutch scholar and journalist, says hookthink is the weapon of breaking news journalists. And it's the upshot of breaking news journalism is the manufacturing of superficiality. This superficiality feeds the beautification of war, the way in which wars appear to become bloodless. You do not, for example, unless you hunt for it, learn much about the ecocidal qualities of these meta-wars, the way in which the meta-wars of our century are makers of junk and spreaders of plastics, of poisons of fields, of farms and forests, juggernaut destroyers, we could say, of our planetary ecosystems. These journalists, breaking news journalists, don't tell us what it's like to have a bullet in the back. They don't tell us how a mother feels when reading stories to their children with bombs falling around them. They do not tell us what it is like for a mother to have a child starved to death in her arms. These journalists do not tell us why soldiers swear profanities, force women and girl children at gunpoint to undress, and then burn their underwear. They do not tell us these things. They do not tell us why relatives who have lost their whole family deem it their duty to piece together the bodies of their loved ones. All of this goes missing in this age of meta-wars. It's also the case that the political economy of wars is very badly handled by breaking news journalists. Let me quote. The New York Times reports, quote, Britain will offer an extra 1.3 billion pounds, about 1.6 billion US dollars, in military support and aid to Ukraine. They don't tell us that the words offer and support are euphemisms for profit-driven selling of weapons of mass destruction. We do not hear about Moscow's Rostec. We don't hear about BAE Systems. We don't hear about Europe's largest arms manufacturer, or Raytheon, the world's biggest guided missile producer, and we don't hear about Lockheed Martin, the global giant of profit-seeking giants. Then there is, of course, the superficial treatment of historically important events. Breaking news journalism has, in the past year, I submit, ignored some of these fundamental questions of our moment. Let us consider the Gaza moment, let's call it. Was the Hamas assault on Israel a lucky, limited strike operation that managed to catch the IDF's Gaza brigade so unawares that most of the 1,400 fighters who scaled fences and who expected to lose their lives actually returned hostages alive, hostages in hand? Or was the Hamas operation designed from the outset to spark a regional war, to lure Israel into an unbearably long war it couldn't possibly win, because that outcome would ultimately require the elimination of all Palestinians, of Hezbollah, of Al-Fajr in Lebanon, Yemen's Houthis, the toppling of the Iranian regime, and the full-scale permanent stationing of the United States and its allies in the region. And more radical questions. Why have mainstream Western media platforms memorialized October the 7th? Why is it that October the 7th has become rhetorically linked, semantically linked to words like Hamas and terrorism and anti-Semitism and Israel's sacred sovereignty and right to exist? We don't hear explanations of this. We barely hear the tabling of these kinds of questions. And I want to give one last example of the superficiality of breaking news journalist treatments, and that is the mega-destructiveness of these wars, of the Grozny, Aleppo, and October the 7th type is for me, very striking. The question is not discussed in mainstream journalism to any extent at all. The question is whether we've entered a new era of meta-wars where the distinction between nuclear and conventional, so-called non-nuclear weapons is finally rendered obsolete. My view is that if you look at, for example, the widespread use of 2,000-pound bombs produced in Texas and in Poland, you see that this distinction is actually a very superficial distinction. But considerations of that kind are not discussed at any length in this breaking news journalism media platform syndrome. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say something about a pathology that results from this beautification of war. It's a claim that needs empirical research, but what I want to suggest to you is that indifference is one of the pathologies, one of the consequences, the emotional consequences of this beautification of war. It's true that there are contexts where when war, so to say, grabs at people's necks and touches their skins, their indifference quickly withers away. It's also true that there are contexts, contemporary Israel, United States after 9/11, where mainstream media coverage of war arouses bellicose passions and loud calls by citizens to wage war on enemies ruthlessly. For reasons that I have no time to explain, I believe that these are exceptions, that these are outliers, that the age of democratic wars, born of the 18th century, are coming to an end, in no small measure because of the usage of overkill weapons of the kind that I have been describing. In striking contrast to the age of democratic citizenship, what we're witnessing is the flourishing of indifference. What is indifference? Philosophically speaking, indifference is the negation of difference. Indifference means not different. It implies undifferentiated neutrality or impartiality, disinterest, and incuriosity about something or someone, a lack of connections or care about matters such as war and peace, right and wrong, good and evil. The indifferent, I submit to you, are not ignorant. They know that these wars are happening. They catch glimpses of these wars. They receive reports, beautified reports of these wars. But they don't care. When confronted with the topic of war, they say things like, whatever, or they ask, who cares? Here, I think, much can be learned, for example, from Jonathan Glazer's recent film, a wonderful film, The Zone of Interest 2023, where you learn that the indifferent person is actually practiced in the arts of detachment. My friend Hassan Haj, the Lebanese anthropologist, Lebanese-Australian anthropologist, says that to be indifferent requires a lot of work on the self. You have to work hard on the self to become detached from the gruesomeness that you would otherwise spot. I do not know how to psychoanalyze this indifference. It's very hard, I think. Is this a case where of simple strategic avoidance, where people calculate that they would lose their jobs, that they would ruin their own reputations if they took an interest in this war and actually protested against this war? I'm not sure. Is it that the age of meta-wars, Evgeny Morozov I have in mind, is an age in which online identity supermarket shopping, as he puts it, is more important than public affairs? Is this the culture that is being created by the beautification of war? I don't know. I could talk about Julian James's bicameral minds. Are the indifferent people who conform to power and yet are preoccupied with themselves and do not see the tensions between this? Are we living in a period, a Dutch communication scholar, Geert Lovink, has said, in which copium addicts are flourishing? Copium is a neologism from coping and opium. You know, people in a life in a world that feels to be spinning out of control are people who withdraw, become indifferent about that because this is a coping mechanism. I don't know whether this is the right way, the right questioning, and I'm not sure what the answers are. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm also not sure to put on the table the question, the ethical question of whether, which is worse, a people who beatify their government leaders, idolize their armed forces, a people who bay for bloody revenge against their enemies on the one hand, the kind of things that you will see in Mehdi Hassan's documentary, Israel's Real Extremism. Or, on the other hand, people who don't care, who knowingly look away, who shut their mouths, who spinelessly do nothing in the face of genocidal wars and eco-destruction. I am not sure what the answer is to this, but what I want to say to you is that indifference, there is a disturbing affinity between indifference and the media beautification of war. I want to not cheer you up, but I want to end by saying something about the limits of this indifference. The word itself, indifference, of course, carries its opposite. It's a word which reminds us that indifference has a flip side. Here I come to a third and final sense of the word meta. We use the word meta in English, for instance, as an adjective or a prefix to describe the way in which any given theme or subject is turned into an object of self-reflection, as in meta-theory, or meta-humor, joking about the way jokes are cracked, and so on. What I want to suggest to you is that this age of digital communications and meta-wars is an age in which new forms of war reporting trigger a self-reflexive meta-coverage of the realities and ethics of war. I see and feel the guillotine coming down on my neck, and so I'm going to literally jump through this to put on the table the broad idea which we can discuss in the Q&A session. What I want to say is that it is the mode of communications, of digital network communications, it's the mode of communications that enables a new kind of journalism. A journalism that expands the meaning of journalism and produces a kind of rebel journalism, I want to say to you. It's a diverse group. There are experienced journalists in their ranks. David Hurst, Rami Khouri, Zaina Khodda, Gideon Levy, Anthony Lowenstein are examples. They work alone or they work for not-for-profit bodies such as Médecins Sans Frontières or Middle East Eye or Oxfam or Plus 972 or the Quds News Network, QNN. What is interesting is, for me, is that this age of meta-wars is a period in which meta-reflection on wars is also being produced, and it helps to explain the resistance in, for example, the Atlantic region to these wars. This rebel journalism is what Umberto Eco would have called semiotic guerrilla work. That is to say, these journalists, frankly, honestly, portray war and in all of its nastiness, in all of its gruesomeness. That is, war is not portrayed as entertainment. War is not aestheticized. I can give many examples of this. I think the turning point in this rise of rebel journalism was probably the Syrian war. It was not because of Deutsche Welle or the BBC that we learned of the gruesomeness of this war. It was rather bodies like the Syrian Observatory or the White Helmets who helped us understand. I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, that this rebel journalism, which is a resistance to the beautification of war, of meta-wars, has a double significance. It redefines journalism to include digital platforms of one kind or another, but it also helps what I would describe as the democratization of war. I don't mean by this unfamiliar phrase that everybody gets a weapon, an AK-47 or an Apache helicopter or something. I mean it's a reflection of the work that I have done over many years on democracy, that what this rebel journalism does is denature war. It's not necessary. There are complex roots. This journalism exposes the complex roots of any particular war. It contests the reigning narratives. And in this sense, that democracy loosens power relations that seem to be fixed, that seem to be natural, that seem to be essential, that seem to be unchanging. This democratization of meta-wars is, it seems to me, a very important source of hope. Why? Because this rebel journalism reminds us that these wars are not only violations of the ethical principle of the equality of people and respect for the earthly habitats in which they dwell. I think one of the interesting features of this rebel journalism is that it's stirring up, if you like, consequentialist arguments against war. Bertrand Russell was one of the earliest proponents of the view that most wars are unnecessary. Most wars are unnecessary, and that almost every war, he remarked, turn out to be much worse than what was thought at the beginning of those wars. And it is for this reason that this rebel journalism, I think, stirs up hope that it is possible to denature war, to limit and to deconstruct the orthodox justifications of war, references to Deuteronomy and so on, and instead stirs up, revives and stirs up and spreads sentiments that date back to the 18th century, in which profound doubts about war's necessity for the first time surfaced, at least on our planet. Ladies and gentlemen, this new journalism that I'm describing as rebel journalism doesn't stop wars. It can't prevent them. But what it can do is do more than destroy hubris and lies and rupture silence. It can sharpen the public visibility of war's awful violence. But what I want to say to you that this rebel journalism, in its meta-commitment to describing the terrible realities of meta-wars, is a kind of journalism that says the unsayable. It calls on citizens to exercise their right not to suffer meta-wars. It says that people everywhere have the power to force the hand of the beauticians of war, to see that war in all its ugliness is increasingly absurd, that in growing numbers of cases it's simply not necessary, and maybe even the utopian hope that there's a time coming when, for the sake of the health of our planet, wars of every kind will have to be abolished. Shukran jazilan. Thank you very much. Do I stay here for the interrogation?
No, come down here.
Okay.
Come down from your pedestal. Take your... شكرا جزيلا للبروفيسور الدكتور جون كين. حقيقة يعني رأيتم يعني كيف الإبداع في هذا المجال، إنه تقديم العمق الأكاديمي السياسي بصورة يعني أول حاجة سلسة وفي نفس الوقت مرتبطة بالواقع والأمثلة الواقعية. فنشكر الدكتور يعني جون على هذه المحاضرة الإبداعية. والآن نسأل الأسئلة والأجوبة. تامر. Take microphone. Where is the microphone at? Okay, continue.
For this very exciting presentation, I have three short questions. I totally appreciate your argument about the notion of indifference, but I'm not at ease with it. And it really depends on which side of it really depends on which side you're standing at. I mean, are you the victim or the aggressor? I mean, for example, in this part of the world, I can personally say that majority of people are not indifferent, but
No.
they're powerless and helpless.
No.
I mean, this, the new journalism in this context of meta wars also, I understand this concept of beautification of wars, but it also brings other opportunities for independent journalism. We see all these social media platforms. My point is that people know what's happening now, but this sense of helplessness and powerlessness is the problem, especially in this part of the world where we don't have functioning democracies, we live under autocracies. So the problem, I mean, the notion of difference for me, I'm quite not comfortable with it. But if we're talking from a democratic, from a perspective of citizens living under democracies, I would say yes, I would be alarmed with this context of indifference because they can afford knowing, they have multi-sources of verifying information. The fact that you live under a healthy democracy give you this right to question, also to feel protected. But it's not happening also maybe for other reasons, that democracies are also becoming dysfunctional in the West as well. They are being, sorry.
اختصار.
Okay, اختصار. So my question is, again, it's the notion indifference. Which audience is it targeted to? Is it the victims or the ones who are orchestrating these meta wars? And last question is, where does this take, and because we're a university here, the notion of an informed citizen, an informed academic, an informed student, where does this leave us? I mean, what challenges are there to look at, to find the truth? And also, where does this leave accountability, especially in democratic contexts where these wars have been repeating itself with different outcomes, but still democracies are not holding these, behind these wars accountable. Thank you.
We take a number and I take notes.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for this great presentation, very insightful. My name is Walid Al-Asfar. Many prominent IT figures, especially in artificial intelligence, were and still warning from mobilizing artificial intelligence. But at the same time, another prominent figure like Eric Schmidt, the founder of Google, or one of the founders of Google, says that he is working very closely with the Pentagon to create, for only $400 drone, fully loaded with AI, that can destroy 400 million or 40 million worth of a tank like. And his excuse is because he was moved and saddened by the innocent victims in Ukraine. So the point of view, the definition of ethics when it comes to war and using technology to weaponize, especially artificial intelligence, is something that I think needs to be focused on more. So what do you think of this? Thank you.
Thank you. إبراهيم.
شكرا.
هنا لو سمحتي.
Thank you very much, Professor. This is really fascinating. Ibrahim Fahad, conflict resolution professor.
Great honor.
I want to thank you also for, our students in conflict studies, and I'm sure in journalism have benefited a lot from this. You described a very fascinating process of meta wars, where also highlighted the main actors of this war. My question is about the dynamics driving this process, and the key, what kind of internal dynamics and relationships among the different actors that you described very beautifully and very accurately that driving this meta war. And what is it in a centralized way that there are key actors that are having more influence than others, and they're setting the stage for the meta war, and are they some of the key actors like the mainstream media, BBC, Deutsche Welle, and others? Aren't they losing grounds for rebel journalism, especially with the impact of the Gaza genocide and how it gave ground, it exposed them, the mainstream media, and gave hope for rebel journalism. Thank you very much.
عايشة.
Thank you, Professor, for this very informative lecture. What you described as meta-wars involved digitally assisted hostilities, assisted by the artificial intelligence, involving extrajudicial killings, and most importantly, as we see it in the genocidal campaign of Israel in the region, it involves a state against non-state actors. And I think this applies mostly to the wars conducted since the War on Terror, which is a lawless war, basically. So I would like to challenge the definition, or actually the characterization of these meta-wars. To what extent you think that this is a war which doesn't actually apply to the definition, to the legal definition and the traditional definition of war, which basically is fought between states, not between a state and non-state actor. Whereas in the case that you just mentioned, I think it doesn't apply, especially to the current context. Thank you.
Define yourself, Aisha. Define.
Aisha Al-Basri, researcher at the Arab Center.
Okay, Walid. After this,
Yeah, I've got. Again, thank you, Professor John. Walid Al-Saqaf, an associate professor in journalism, and I'm really delighted that you brought up the aspect of journalism, given the fact that it has a major role in many of the wars. What I'd like to refer to is during the academic year, we go through various theories around journalism, and one area that I've been working on is called peace journalism. You may recall Johan Galtung's idea that there is conflict journalism and peace journalism, and many of the constructive journalism, for example, various other forms of journalism to come to in terms of the role of positive to society. But then one of the dilemmas is that journalism doesn't work in isolation. It works as part of a bigger context, and one of the major challenges that we face is the importance of having eyeballs. You can't really capture the attention of the audience. Even if you have the most perfect form of journalism, you need means of attracting the audiences. But there has been a stream of new initiatives, and we recalled a few. I'd like to get your opinion about the new form of purely digital platforms that are based on telling the alternative view. An example is Zoteo by Mehdi Hassan. I mean, other platforms of this sort. Do they constitute a form of rebel journalism, or are there elements that you can define? Do you consider this as a theoretical framework that we can develop further? And I'm happy to get engaged later on, perhaps, in working together on this. Thank you.
Shukran jazilan for this very long list of questions. I think this is working. Thank you very much. I am sure that I cannot satisfy any of the 5 questions, and I thank them very much for their remarks. I'll just work through these sequentially. I think I made clear at the beginning, but perhaps it got too global, too universal. It's one of the diseases of being an intellectual. That I was referring mostly to the so-called democratic world of the Atlantic region, in which indifference, I was describing to almost anthropologically how it feels in the last year, that indifference is alive and well. People know this is not ignorance. This is the important point. It's not, Stanley Cohen was one of the scholars who wrote 25 years ago about denial, where denial has a different dynamic. Indifference is when, to repeat, people know these things are going on, but it's like I have other things to be concerned about. And as in the Jonathan Glazer film and in a lot of literature on indifference, which I think deserves a resuscitation, you see how troubling it is. And my conjecture, it's a theoretical conjecture, of course, is that the beautification of war is the soil in which this indifference grows. When war feels bloodless, when there is no butchery, when there are no perversions of the kind at one point I mentioned, you know, the burning of women and girls' underwear, what is this about? When there is not coverage of this, indifference can not only survive but thrive. So this is this was a description of a certain patch of the earth, which happens, of course, to be the heartlands of the wars that are being prosecuted. On the informed citizen, the informed student, it's a long discussion. I'm no fan of the informed citizen notion. It's born, actually, of the late 19th century in the United States, and it has very soiled roots. The informed citizen was used to disenfranchise black voters. These are ignorant blacks, and the informed citizen should be the one who, you know, is entitled to participate in elections. And philosophically, I have a problem with informed citizen. What is the informed citizen? Someone who knows everything about everything. This is not possible. What I have tried to say in my work, first in the media book of 2013, is I prefer the notion of wise citizen. The wise citizen, I don't know how you translate it in Arabic, but the wise citizen is someone who knows that they don't know everything about everything, and they also know that those who rule and govern don't know everything either, which is why they need to be monitored and why they should not be fully trusted. The wise citizen is a much more humble notion, it seems to me. The problem that your question rightly puts on the table, which you've exposed, is that the indifferent citizen is a real threat to the wise citizen. The indifferent citizen is capable of putting up with anything, and life goes on. Even though the thesis I put to you is that the barbarity of wars is increasing because of their meta qualities, and these are wars that are ecocidal. This doesn't get very much treatment. Look at Gaza. What is it? Yes, it's a pile of rubble and people who are constantly harassed and pushed around, and thousands upon thousands of deaths and traumatization of peoples. But it's also, it's an ecocidal disaster. Every war is now like this. When did it begin? Well, you could say, you know, this started in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My retort is that actually the normalization of these meta-wars is destroying that distinction between the nuclear and non-nuclear. On second question on AI, the short answer is, you know, these are AI wars. The booby-trapping of pages and the injuring of several thousand people wearing these pages is unthinkable in the era of electronic broadcasting, or in the era of newspapers, or in the era of orality. It's McLuhan's point, again, that there is an artificial intelligence dynamic in this digital, unfinished digital communications revolution, when harnessed, has extremely destructive effects. And it's not surprising, it's perhaps a source of hope, that petitions against the militarization of robotics are now circulating, because if this artificial intelligence-driven weaponization of war continues, then this will end very badly indeed. To Ibrahim Fraya, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to meet you. I can't answer all of these points that you make. I do want to confess that the inspiration for this notion of meta-wars is by a young Chinese scholar who first used the phrase in Chinese, but it was translated as metaverse wars and he was inspired by the transformation of Zuckerberg's company into Meta. And, you know, what I presented to you was, I think, a different, more elaborate, more complex version of this Chinese scholar's view, where the basic idea is that war, it feels as though millions of people are drawn into a sort of video game scenario, where, you know, limbs are not lost. I mean, there's shooting and there's smoke and the buildings are destroyed, but it's as if you're sitting with your, you know, headphones on, and you're not experiencing war. War is somehow something that happens in the metaverse. And the dynamics, I think, are multiple. I'm a Max Weberian on this. I don't like single explanations of things. The world is a pretty complex place, I've learned in life. And it partly is driven, I would be blunt and say, by American-led governmental mediation of war. Jake Sullivan is I have nothing personally against him, but I mean, here's a sort of emblem of this. But it's also, you know, platforms that are taxpayer funded. The BBC are doing this, Deutsche Welle does this. Deutsche Welle is unconditionally loyal to Israel. And so therefore, you know, whatever coverage there is globally is just put out. And it's also driven by private corporations of the meta kind. So multiple dynamics are driving this. You could have asked me the really tricky question, is this rebel journalism able to actually counter the tremendous force? I don't know what the answer is. I do want to say to all of you that if you think that this lecture ended on a completely unconvincing utopian note, that I use the word hope, and I want to say just a sentence about hope, which is that hope is not rainbows of the mind. It's not wishful thinking. Hope is something different. Hope is the experience possibility that things could be different than they are now. The experience, the bodily experience that something could be different. Well, I think that this, what I described as rebel journalism, does exactly this. It puts that proposition on the table. Do you want, you know, a world in which what we're witnessing, and it seems gathering pace, would be universalized, so that these meta wars, you know, erupt on various points of the planet, more points than at present. Your question about non-state actors, it's a very interesting question. I think, I mentioned it briefly, I suspect that most of you have lots to say and feelings about this. The world feels to me, in pondering the last 12 months to this day, that lawlessness is gaining ground. That states and non-state actors are doing things that are in complete defiance of laws, of the rules-based order. It's in disarray. It's lost, it's losing, and probably has lost most of its legitimacy. And that's very scary. What I tried to say is that these meta-wars, yes, they do defy the laws of war that have a much older history, and non-state actors are certainly part of this new trend. About conflict versus peace journalism, a bit old-fashioned, important. Had I more time, I would have tried to explain, as I do in the written paper, which is 10,000 words or more, frighteningly, is that this rebel journalism, in a way, keeps alive these traditions of what you call peace journalism, keeps alive traditions of thinking, dispositions that have their roots, at least in the European world, in the 18th century, where for the first time, Figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau propose that war is not necessary, that it's possible to erect institutions to prevent war in all of their horrors. Kant is part of this. I think this journalism keeps alive those sentiments. How to attract eyeballs, I didn't discuss. That is a question that every rebel journalism platform, discusses. In the Arab world, there are many such platforms. And what I wanted to say, however, was that this rebel journalism is transforming the meaning of journalism. Journalism originally comes in the English language, it comes from the French, and a journalist is someone who reports the daily, the daily event. And initially it was in the print medium, the printing press, the first daily newspaper and so on. Later, early 20th century, journalism is redefined, expanded to include radio and television. There's the transformation of mode of communications transforms the mode of understanding of journalism. And my suggestion here is that this digital unfinished revolution is doing the same. It's producing a new kind of journalism that's much wider. And do we think of Amnesty or Oxfam or Syrian Observatory as journalism? My suggestion is yes, it can be included in this trend. Finally, this is an interpretation of the very complex world in which we're living. What I was forced to do by Professor El Effendi, because he chose for me the date on which to deliver this, I thought that I wouldn't speak about democracy or anything like this, that I should discuss war. And this is an interpretation of the times through which we're living. I do believe that, the topic of war, for various reasons, has become disconnected from communications media. They need to be reconnected. That's what I learned in Toronto from McLuhan, who is vastly now overwhelmingly outdated. But that was the insight that the experience of war in all of its horrors is always mediated within armies and in the weaponry that's used and in the attraction of audiences. I think there is something new, something meta about these wars. And in this sense, finally, I wanted to say that these wars are meta in three senses. There's something new that my grandparents would be astonished if they were with me still. They would not recognize these wars. They're meta in the sense that there's a gamification of war. And they're meta in the sense that there is still this resistance to the naturalization of war, to the beautification of war. And that's the source, it seems to me, of the hope that these wars will have to be constrained by new institutions and by new laws and, of course, by civil resistance to them. Please don't ask me how and when that's going to happen.
عندنا سؤال سؤالين مسافة ولا خلاص؟ Okay, the lady there. هنا. عرفي نفسك.
Lilian Stefanos, postdoctoral fellow. So thank you, Prof. John, for this fascinating talk. I just have some thoughts that I want to share with everyone. So first, about the idea of indifference. Coming from Canada and living in Canada for almost 15 years, but I'm also originally Egyptian, so I can see both words. And I can have some understanding from talking with people why they're indifferent. They are not indifferent about what's happening in the world. They are indifferent about the media, the institutions, the system, politicians, because they lost trust. They lost trust in people that we used to trust, in the government. Since, let's say, like 2020, 2021, even medical institutions with COVID, whatever was happening in the media, people feel that these channels are encouraging divisions, are inciting divisions rather than bringing people together. Same what's happening in everywhere and everything that we see right now in Ukraine, Sudan, Lebanon, Palestine. We see that it's more about encouraging separation rather than bringing people together. So in the West, they are kind of tired of seeing this. That's why they are indifferent. The other thing when we talk about upholding humanitarian principle, which was a lecture last week, and it's very relevant what we're talking about today, and that word became like the use of technology and words, so we cannot criminalize these things. It's hard when we put it on paper. If we think about doctrines and treaties, how to treat these kind of words, there is no way. There is no way, even if we try to perfect what's on paper, the actual problem will always be there. So back to this, when we talk about the macro level, which is the state and what's beyond the state, we always forget the micro level, which is the human being. We talk about humanitarian principles without paying attention to how to deal with the roots of the problem. Here I'm talking again about instead of perfecting everything that's on paper, trying to work with people, trying to work with humans. So talking about educational institutions, religious institutions, etc. I think the answer can come from narrowing the gap between what's on top and what's in the micro level. Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you everyone for listening.
I think we are probably finished now, but I will give a final question. You spoke about meta wars and give, for example, Gaza an example, and maybe other. The question is that, are these really wars? Because what you have here is one-sided kind of power being applied. I mean, Gaza is merely civilians. These people are being bombed. Their homes are being broken. They're asked to move from here to here. And it's really, the name war might be a mistake, I think a category mistake. War is when two sides are fighting. But when one side is unreachable practically, even in Lebanon, in South Lebanon, when, or in Iraq before that, for the Americans, when somebody has these airplanes and drones, as you said, and all sorts of weapons, which attack people from afar, and the people who are doing it are reachable. I think this is just like maybe to say that, for example, in the Holocaust was a war. So shouldn't we rethink this also a bit?
No. I mean, I think the onus then, Professor El Effendi, is to give us a signifier to replace war, and I'm not sure what that would be. But I mean, I think the simple retort, I'm not being nonchalant and flippant here, is that, you know, in wars, the other partner is crushed. And yeah, they have a one-sided quality. That is true. I thought you would ask, you know, what becomes of the category of war which is, you know, historically an invention, and it refers to the formation of an armed group to resolve a power dispute against another. This is in the very abstract. This is what war is, very abstract. And of course, as I tried to say, the mode and the weapons of war undergo enormous changes since its invention. The victims of war, as we know well, since in my lifetime, have become principally civilians. That is true. They are not armed. They are not part of this, simple definition of war. I thought you would ask me that, but I do. You arouse in me some passion when you say maybe the word is a category mistake. I think if we throw out that signifier, then we throw away a word that still continues to have, among rebel journalists, for instance, a seriousness, a semantic, palpable significance, and we would be more vulnerable without it. To Lilian, I mean, you made many points. You are right, and several questioners have pointed out that indifference flourishes in polities where millions of people are disaffected. They are really pissed off. They don't like the government, they don't like politicians, they feel that there is, that the cards are stacked against them. And there are various causes of this, multiple causes of this. It's feeding the demagoguery, the populist demagoguery of our era. And it's in that context that, oddly, indifference flourishes as well. And I think it's a very toxic devil's brew, so to say. But concerns about the system, as you put it, are very central. I'm not sure if it has to do with the incitement of divisions. And I wanted to say that this is more than war fatigue. This is, war fatigue is not what I have in mind. That's a common, descriptor of a trend of wars in our age. I think indifference is a much sharper category, and I think it deserves more research and certainly more thinking about. I want to repeat again that this era of meta-wars is an era in which semantic struggles about war, about the meaning of war, about the significance of war, about the devastating consequences of war. Semantic struggles are happening. That is for sure, and that is also true in the heartlands of indifference. You see, yesterday there were very large demonstrations in many cities. What motivates these demonstrations, these street actions? Well, it's many reasons, but one of them is that those who are on the streets access other media. They are in touch with this rebel journalism that I'm describing. About humanitarian principles, it will shock you if I say that I'm not such a great fan of humanity. I mean, over the years, I'm old enough to think that nothing surprises me about what humans are capable of doing to others. Nothing surprises me. When I meet, it's not pessimism. When I meet good people, I'm cheered up. It's like there's still hope, and it has a special significance. But the problem with human rights, language, and humanitarian law, if you followed the lecture today in its depth, I didn't put it well enough, is that the deprivileging of the human in relation to ecological milieu is really one of the developments of our times. We are learning that these wars are producing Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's on a large scale. I don't know when it began. Grozny for me was personally, you know, that on the border of Serbia and Croatia was a war where a city is destroyed, totally destroyed, rubbled. This is now the norm. And all trees, all living species are destroyed as well. This is another argument against war that, for example, Bertrand Russell never considered in, say, the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And one last thing, these resistances that I've been describing, it applies to Canada, it applies to the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. These are resistances of this old-fashioned notion of civil society. You know, these are networks of people, you know, who actually refuse indifference and feel passion. They feel in their guts a distaste, a contempt for the lies and the nonsense and the violence and the ecological destruction of milieu in which people live. And so we're back to a very old problematic, at least in the Atlantic region and the West. You know, is this civil society, is it capable of growing? Is it capable of, with the help of rebel journalism, refusing the orthodox narratives? I don't know. I don't, you know, we intellectuals don't have, luckily, we don't have foresight. We are not God. And so we can't anticipate entirely what is going to happen.
I think before thanking John, I'd like to point out, especially to who are left of our students, this is an example of multidisciplinarity. Here you are using media studies, politics, environmental studies, sociology, quite a lovely and seamless mixing or using of multidisciplines in a wonderful paper. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, everyone.